It's more than 200 pages, Camilla, the first stage of the COVID inquiry into the pandemic. Baroness Hallett is the chair of that inquiry. Let's listen to her long list of the astonishing failures in the run-up to the pandemic.
The UK government's sole pandemic strategy from 2011 was outdated and lacked adaptability. It was never, in fact, properly tested. The UK government neither applied it nor adapted it, and the doctrine that underpinned it was ultimately abandoned, as was the 2011 strategy itself. I have no hesitation in concluding that the processes, planning and policy of the civil contingency structures across the United Kingdom failed the citizens of all four nations. There were serious errors on the part of the state and serious flaws in our civil emergency systems.
Our own chief reporter, Robert Mendick, was one of the journalists at a lock-in in central London all morning, poring over the findings, and he sent us this dispatch with all the details.
Stood outside the COVID inquiry where we've just had delivery of the first report of the first module into into the preparedness and resilience of the UK to combat what proved to be a deadly virus that killed 230,000 people in the UK. Baroness Hallett in this report, it's 217 pages, 83,000 words, doesn't really pull her punches. This was a government that failed its citizens, is what she says. We ended up with a far greater death toll, although she doesn't quantify it, than really we should have had. And that's because we went into this pandemic, not least looking at the wrong kind of pandemic. We looked at a flu pandemic. We should have been looking at a coronavirus, or we should have included in our planning looking at a coronavirus. Asia had SARS and it had MERS. We were only looking at a flu pandemic. What COVID was a more deadly disease than flu, and what we didn't have in place were things like test and trace. We didn't have in place methods for combating the virus. We didn't have any kind of early system for lockdown. We had a strategic plan dating back to 2011 that by the time the pandemic started in 2020 was out of date and wasn't right, and it wasn't right for the thing that killed so many people. One of the things I think this looked at is why it was that we had a 2011 plan and no one ever sought to raise the issue of why hadn't we looked at other viruses, why weren't we looking. One of the things Baroness Hallett says is that we had a problem with groupthink. We had everyone thinking the same thing. No one was willing to say, put their hand up in the air and say, have we got this right? And so we went into the pandemic in 2020 ill-prepared, and that has caused huge loss of life, or added to the huge loss of life that clearly coronavirus was going to cause. UK did pretty badly, as we know, in the pandemic. It led to lockdowns that were far longer, so we have that further issue due to the ill-preparedness. And she sort of, that will be looked at in future modules, but she looks at that and she does say that this took its toll on children, it took its toll on mental health, it took its toll on the most vulnerable people in society. Ministers over the years really failed us. They were responsible, and she says that health secretaries were responsible. They were the people in charge of these plans. There are other issues that this throws up, and Baroness Hallett comes up with a 10-point plan, 10 recommendations for making sure this, if we do get struck by a pandemic, it doesn't happen in the future. I'll just consult. She, in remarks she's made after the inquiry landed at noon today, she says there will be a next time. She says the expert evidence suggests it's not a question of if another pandemic will strike, but when. The evidence is overwhelmingly to the effect that another pandemic, potentially one that is even more transmissible and lethal, is likely to occur in the near to medium future. In other words, there will be another pandemic. That's why this is important. That's why it matters. This is not a hindsight thing. This is practical too, about going forward. Recommendations that include setting up committees that will properly answer to Cabinet and where people will be responsible. They won't just bureaucratically come up with plans that then get messed up in a quagmire and don't get looked at again.
We'll get into this, Kamal, but it speaks to the sort of chaos at the heart of government. But also, I think, all these months, actually years on, it's easy to forget the numbers involved in this. 235,000 people died from illnesses involving COVID-19 up to the end of 2023. Also, the inquiry quite rightly recognised the terrible damage done by the pandemic to the economy, to children's education, mental health, and we're still seeing the ramifications of this to this day, to the NHS and its waiting lists.
It's almost the reason for government are things like pandemics, because they so rarely happen. It is up to the government to have institutional memory, to test itself, to be prepared for things that are once-in-a-century events. And just remembering back, both of us, Camilla, reported hugely or ran big news departments through the pandemic. It was clear that the government simply wasn't prepared. It wasn't thinking about its fundamental duty to citizens. Policies changing, the amazing work that we did, the lockdown files as they became, when we revealed that it was government by WhatsApp, that people were making decisions in real time. Now, of course, difficult times. No one would say that it should be run perfectly or smoothly in a situation like this, but the fact that there was so little planning, it comes down to this idea of you can't constantly run governments via headline, via clever social media posts, by, as we've kept saying, haven't we, Camilla, so many times with this new government, for example, government is tough, and often it's not boring, but it's the tedious detail that really matters about things like your civil emergency planning. That is not going to get you the lead in the newspapers, but it really matters.
I thought what was interesting about what Baroness Hallett said about this 2011 plan, which was the actual plan that they should have followed. It was tailored towards an influenza epidemic, admittedly, but that was kind of the document, the sort of blueprint for if this happens. I think it was created after SARS. Obviously, it had affected huge swathes of Asia. And it was created to provide a template for the government to follow. OK, it was out of date, and she then reveals that actually Matt Hancock tore it up completely. What troubles me is, on this newspaper, we also did a lot of work revealing what had happened in 2016, in that October, when the government carried out this exercise called Exercise Cygnus. And this was meant to be a dry run of how all of the relevant departments, all of the relevant stakeholders would react if we had another pandemic in line with SARS or similar. And it basically was a 3-day exercise where all of the vested interests came together. I think there were 950 officials involved. They war-gamed each scenario. They had predicted, actually, that it might be something that would affect up to 50% of the population and result in 400,000 excess deaths. So it was a proper exercise in how to cope with a pandemic situation. A report was published. What happened to that exercise? Hallett's talking about 2011. It was updated in 2016, and none of the protocols appear to have been followed, which then kind of, it blows your mind, doesn't it? Because from a public perspective, you're sort of looking at it going, why on earth do these things if you're not actually going to follow your own conclusions and recommendations?
The production of the report is the output.
Yeah.
And that is the problem, not the action that you take because of the report. And the Post Office inquiry is still going on today. We've had Sir Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, giving evidence in that scandalous treatment of postmasters and postmistresses and Horizon controversy and the computer system there. That is ongoing at present, showing failure of leadership. We've covered on this podcast, and also we have done as the Telegraph, huge amounts of work around the infected blood scandal. We've talked as well on this podcast about maternity care. This podcast has been in production, was launched just 2 months ago, Camilla. And how many times have we discussed the competency of government, the competency of official organisations, and it adds to the trust deficit, the idea that everything is broken. And this is all about COVID, and we must not forget the victims, the lack of justice for them. How are we going to deal with really learning these lessons? But also there is a big, deep lesson here for the new government, for any subsequent governments, that they need to understand that as I said at the top of the podcast, the first duty of government is to protect its citizens.
Can we also discuss, we can have a conversation about what government needs to learn. We also, I think, need to have a conversation about what experts and the scientific community needs to learn from this, because Baroness Hallett has made a point about groupthink taking hold. And if we reflect on those times and we reflect on the fact, and maybe it is a consequence of social media, we had a situation really bizarrely and counterintuitively that people in the scientific community who questioned the data, who questioned the modelling, and who questioned the approach were effectively cancelled. They were sort of put in this pile of cranks and anti-vaxxers and weren't listened to, when I thought, and when I was reporting it at the time, that seemed so obtuse, because I thought the whole point about science was to listen to all views and consider all options. Another point that Hallett makes is the lack of recognition that was given to the social and other consequences of lockdown. So it was this path towards lockdown, not really considering the excess deaths that would be caused not by COVID, not by people being killed by COVID, but people being killed by the measures put in place to prevent COVID. And we are still seeing the effects of that today. We are still talking about late cancer diagnoses. I do a lot of work, as you know, in the alcohol harm space, and alcohol-related deaths spiralled during COVID. We're still talking about the legacy left on a generation of children who were denied opportunities at school, who didn't make their end-of-year proms, who had their educational chances hampered by the fact that they couldn't actually do their GCSEs and A-levels. We're still dealing with that now, and yet, looking back, there wasn't really any forward thinking in that regard.
This is the first stage of a very detailed inquiry system. We are going to have a full report on the effects of lockdown, I think touching on many of the very powerful points you make. And again, remembering back to the reporting of this, it almost became a political argument between the four nations.
Yes, Sturgeon versus Johnson.
Yes, was Nicola Sturgeon better than Boris Johnson? And was, the Welsh government approaching it in the right way, and then Northern Ireland, and how were things happening there? We had all these devolved powers, but no way of the four nations working together, which clearly they needed to. And everything became defined as a political argument. I think that builds on your idea that some scientists were seen as, not in the right place, and then politicians were seen as not in the right place, and it became this political argument when you do need sobriety at these moments. You need a sense of, where does the evidence lead us? Let's test that evidence, and let's make the best judgment that we can. Do you remember, Camilla, that everything was about we follow the science? But the problem was there's no clear trail following the science. Just saying that was very politicized in the way that we understood what science is. Science is a fan of possibilities.
Yeah.
It's not a route, but it became a route.
But that was the ultimate buck pass. The politicians were saying we're following the science so that they wouldn't be blamed for the decisions that they then made, even if the science was at times questionable. And they were shopping trolleying around with which science they followed on any given day.
And the idea that you could run anything via messages on your phone, when you're talking about the hundreds of thousands of deaths, you're talking about all the effects that happened after COVID, as you say, around cancer, around alcohol-related deaths, that you're doing that messaging on your phone to make sure the next day's headline was the right headline.
And yet at the same time, we haven't even got onto the fact that they weren't even following their own rules.
My goodness, Partygate, of course, is the horrible smell that underlies so much of this.